All right, welcome to another edition of Unstructured Unlocked. I'm Tom Wilde.
I'm co-host Michelle Gouveia.
Michelle, we've got a great guest with us today, Bill Costa,
We
uh,
do.
very experienced insurance executive. We'll let Bill give all the details, but including extensive roles at Geico and now consulting to the insurance industry. But Bill, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We'd
Yes.
love to hear a bit more about your background as we kick this one off.
My story is I went from essentially the back office job to kind of the front lines in digital. So I started as an actuary, which is very much a back office role, but really got, exposure to how the business functions. But then worked my way through big data, analytics, data science, and product development, and more towards the front end and operations, working with operational standards and then customer experience in the digital applications, and really was able to see how data and the business runs in reality and generates the data that the back office sees. So I had a lot of experience along the way from front to back. But since leaving Geico, retiring from Geico in 2021, I've had the opportunity to get involved with and seeing a lot of different companies, dozens of companies and how they operate across different lines of business and insurance. And it's been very interesting to see, all the different strengths that different companies have, but also the needs they have in order to transform their business and modernize it. So been focused a lot on telematics and bringing telematics to the auto insurance industry. And that's worldwide, not just in the US. And really with the purpose of transforming insurance for the betterment of not just the insurance company, but for consumers. And so very much a bias towards consumer-centric solutions. Several years I've worked with a data provider, but I wanted to tie in one thing. I work with a credit union, currently Baxter Credit Union. I serve on the board, but the tie to financial services. So insurance and financial services, I think it's worth considering the impact on both and the synergy between the two, and learning how to apply some of the technology that's available and that we're going to talk about. So.
Awesome. That's a great topic to dig into. Maybe start there a little bit. I'm curious, how do you see those relationships, as it relates to some of the things that you've experienced in your career? How do you tie them together?
Well, I think the way that transformation works, and I think insurance has been slow to transform it. So I think there's a huge opportunity across all the different lines of business. But I think the synergy is focusing on the purpose. I'm very mission driven, and that's something that was really coached and trained at Geico to be very mission driven. But I believe in it. I think there's getting back to first principles and what the mission is of insurance and what the mission is of financial services. And it's very customer centric to be able to help them. And I think that's the key to really the way to transform. It is not getting stuck in the way things have been done in the past, but looking for new ways to serve the original mission of the business, both in insurance and financial services.
How did you think about that mission across the different roles that you've had, right? How you can execute on something like that from a position as an actuary to someone on the front lines building a digital interface strategy, I imagine has to be pretty different in how you can actually move the needle on that.
When you start as an actuary, start in the back office, you're given data. You don't know how it's created, but as you start to peel back and see how the data is collected, it's eye-opening, and you're almost shocked, what it takes. And so what I see of technology, I worked a lot towards making that conversation with the customer much easier. And the key to that is the exchange of data to make that happen a lot more effectively for both parties. If you can collect and verify information in an efficient manner, the customer experience is great. And then the benefit to the company is you have verified information, which always works better than having to ask the customer. So, that push, I think, was very strong at Geico. I think very strong in the industry now. And there's limitations on the old ways of doing things. And so now you have companies coming in to really expand the capabilities of being able to exchange data with consumers. So I think that's really what I observed. And that I spent a lot of time on the applications for sales, service, and underwriting, and how to best execute the underwriting and the product side of it within those applications. And so get the actuary or the underwriter that requests or requires some piece of information in order to do their job. And yet the front lines and the application side of it, the operation side, has to engage with the customer to get that. And those friction points are significant. Those impact customer satisfaction, they impact the performance of the insurance company, and they impact, the reputation of the company. So I think, that's a key to success. And that was the eye-opening part of going from front end to the operational side.
So there's been a lot written about how this unlocks the potential for new products or new modes of insurance, especially with such huge changes in mobility. And I think you have a lot more data now about the objects being insured, vehicles, et cetera, and a lot more understanding about the people being insured and how they use those objects, those mobility devices, cars, et cetera. Are we getting closer to sort of almost insurance as a utility where your rates vary based on when you're driving, how much you're driving, how you're driving, the geography of where you're driving? Can it get to that level of granularity in terms of a truly personalized insurance product?
Well, the technology is there for driving, and being involved in telematics throughout a lot of my engagements, and certainly part of my mission is to change the driving behavior such that it's safer on the roads. But to your point, even I'm sure you've experienced this, probably where you live and places where you visit, you see scooters on the road, right? You see these new, and they're left everywhere, which is, that's a whole other story. Like where you see some of these scooters, like, how come no one's coming to pick this up and bring it back? But anyways, that's a huge mode of mobility, right? And that's something that I think there's been a lot of discussion. I was involved in a discussion just yesterday about this, how they're expecting an increase in regulation on how motorcycles and scooters are actually used, because it's needed. It's kind of the Wild West right now on there. So you talk about new products and adapting to what the world is practicing. Yes, it's, how do you adapt to those scooters, right? And I think technology is the key. Smart technology and leveraging it with good partners is the key to be able to expand, because the traditional insurance practice is fairly what I would call brittle, right? The underwriting practices and the claims practices in a traditional sense, can be brittle unless you have the solutions, the right data, the right partners, the right fully thought out process in order to build these new products and build these new capabilities. And that's where partnerships really matter, because it's not necessarily going to come from within the traditional insurance companies.
I think some of the relationship between insured and insurers, especially in personal lines, is under stress right now. You read about people being canceled based on drone surveys of their property. You have the stories of vehicle data being licensed to LexisNexis, and it's not easy to opt out of that. As a consumer, you may not even know that's happening. Is this sort of a temporary moment in time? I mean, I think the sort of transition from give me value for sharing that data with you versus kind of more of a surveillance type approach. How do you think about that now that you're sort of, a consultant? Maybe you can say a little bit more about your opinions there. I think that's a big open question right now in this category.
You tapped in. Yeah, it's a great point, because I am much more customer centric in my views and perspectives as a consultant and independent strategic advisor. So that's something that I think is the key. Like, if you actually made the information that is shared available to the consumer so that they know it's being collected and they know what it says, they know what it means.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know what the data means. The example of in the vehicle sharing, the connected vehicle sharing with LexisNexis, any customer can request the information that's being shared with them. But in this case, with the information they receive back from LexisNexis, like 300 pages of detailed telematics data. It didn't really say, well, how good is your driving or not?
Right.
And there are some applications that the technology exists to convey that to consumers, but it's not being leveraged well in the products and the economics that are deployed today. I think in order to really have telematics accelerate is to solve the customer centricity of the product. If you do that and you have the customer and they can take their, for example, portability, they can take their information and go from one insurance carrier to another insurance carrier, right? The next insurance carrier that wants to insure that customer is going to reflect, their driving data if they have it. But today it's not available. So it's kind of like your credit score. Your
Yeah.
credit score in the past, everyone could get it when they're at the point of sale. And that's not the case today with driving data.
Bill, I want to shift it a little bit back to maybe this is a little even earlier in just the life cycle of like telematics adoption. But when telematics first, or IoT devices in general, first came out, there was just this influx of we're going to have all this data that we're going to give us more insights. We're going to be able to build new products, underwrite better, claims, handling will be streamlined. In your experience, are carriers able to adequately digest that data in a way that does actually improve those work streams that is the goal of having all that data?
I think when it's available, insurers do it fairly well, use it fairly well. But if you think about the expansion of those sources, and the vehicle data is still being cultivated and made available, right? But it goes through that. It's going through different providers. LexisNexis is just one example of that. Or you could go directly to the manufacturer in some cases and get the data. Well, that's in a sense a limitation. There's this whole process of being able to take this vast amount of data and make it usable for the customer or usable for the insurance purpose. And that's the key. Like, what's the platform to be able to do that and do that well and expand it? We're talking about telematics, and telematics have been around for a while. Well, what about all the new sources for small business, right? And property? A lot of property insurers use, well, of course, they use drone technology to check out the roof condition because that's one of the biggest drivers of claims in the industry. But I mean, there are a number of other things that can be done with technology to collect information necessary to execute an insurance policy that's transparent to the consumer. So this example of telematics is not just limited to auto insurance and telematics. It's a use case where you take this amount of information and somehow have to translate it to make it useful to the insurer and to the customer. And that's where the key, I think, value for AI is. Like, if it can do that in a very efficient way and keep adding different sources, so expanding the level of information that's available, I think whoever figures out how to do that in a repeatable, accelerated way is really going to be able to transform their insurance products a lot faster than the rest of the industry.
Well, you almost become, and insurance has always had this element to it, but being a strategic partner in loss prevention, not just loss protection. We chatted with Hartford Steam Boiler, and we talked about sort of IoT and the ability to share that insight back to the customer almost in real time, that, hey, this IoT data, based on what we've seen in other places, suggests that this machine is headed for a breakdown, or could cause a fire, or whatever it might be, whatever kind of loss that could be incurred from that, which is an interesting position for the insurance industry to be in, which is much more of a preventative partner than just a restorative partner.
I couldn't agree more. Like, the whole use case of like driving data to be able to improve someone's driving, not just reflect their score, but actually improve their score, is analogous to what you're saying. We also have here, and I have at home, a security system that's also linked to, it detects when there's a water leak, detects if there's radon. I mean, there are devices that can be used to mitigate and avoid loss. Right. And I think that's what you're speaking to. Hartford Steam Boiler actually has some really cool hardware and solutions for that apparently leads to dramatic savings and risk avoidance. So I think that's hugely available. But think about the availability of my security system with all those different sensors that can prevent losses or detect and mitigate losses. How does an insurance company get that information? Like that's what people should be thinking about, because I have it here at home. I should be able to share it. How do I share it? So customers want to share it because they have these things.
Yeah.
Insurers want to use that because it's going to be a lot more effective, but there's not really that in between capability to enable that. And I think that's what companies should be focused on.
Yeah, the sharing, and then how do you generate actionable insights from it, which is more the sort of AI opportunity.
Right, right.
Well, and then I think there's also the element of how do you, and this is probably a good use case for AI once it gets trained on it, is how do you sift through false positives, right? Especially when you think about, is this really a water leak or did I just leave my sink on and I know it's on and I just have to turn it, right? So there's ways that you can add automation to what would traditionally be a very manual process of reviewing something, probably making a call, assessing that the alert was negative, for lack of a better word, and then, putting that data back into the system. So I think even on the device management or the management of data coming through the devices, there's probably a good use case there for AI, depending on how integrated you have people into that management process.
Right. And you wouldn't want, for example, if you've had that happen in the past, let's say you had a minor water leak, the sensor kicked in, you avoided a major loss. You don't want that to be a negative factor in future insurance policies, right? Because you actually had something in place to mitigate the loss. And so to your point, assessing the overall result, is very important. That's on the post side. I know you're talking about at the time to make sure that you can prevent it too.
And I wonder, and maybe you saw more of this at Geico. As a consumer, I don't know that I've experienced this, but with the rise in cat losses and weather related impacts, the insurance companies really are in an advantage position to know what kind of losses come from what kind of weather events. And is there an opportunity to be more proactive as an insurer to reach out to their customers in advance of some of these events and say, hey, hail's forecasted. Here's some top tips to prevent hail damage to your vehicle, ABC. I'm just making it up, or flood risk, or et cetera. Where have you seen that kind of more proactive advice or outreach in the personal line space? It seems like that's an opportunity as well.
Well, the companies have had the ability to alert insureds, let's say when hurricanes are coming. That's an easier one because you know that it's coming a bit beforehand. But there are alerting systems for consumers that are insurance companies deploy today. I think hailstorms are harder. They can come up and they can be very damaging, but I think they occur, without a lot of advance notice. So, right.
I remember seeing there are some large insurance carriers that have partnered with like Amazon and like Alexa, and like you can they push alerts where it's that preventative component of it. So it's summer, it's getting hot. Make sure that the surrounding area of your home is clear of debris because there's wildfire risk in your area. Or from that consumer centric side, they've really been trying to be this value added partner for some of that. I think the really interesting part going back to it is just how do you capture that data? Like some of it is meant to be actionable. How do you actually convince the end consumer to take action? I think is the big question that insurance carriers think about.
Well, think about let's carry that back to the mission. Like, do insurance carriers really consider their mission to include that or not?
Yeah.
And I think that's a nuance or it's a pretty significant change. I don't think a lot of companies do that. Instead, they almost consider the claims service as when they make, they write a check and they're done. And consumers don't think that. I don't think most consumers just want to get back, just want things fixed and go back to normal life as much as possible. And so I think, or they want to avoid it, right? It would be better to avoid it and, be a safe driver, have a safe home. And then if something happens, to facilitate the efficient and fair, way of getting back to normalcy. I think that's what the mission is really with insurance. And I don't think a lot of insurance carriers see it that way. Otherwise, you'd get into, well, on the health insurance side, you get into wellness programs, right? And so, where's the personal lines and the commercial lines view of that? Like, where I know that there are some
Yeah, it's a good, it's
Risk
a good
mitigation
analogy.
programs for larger carriers, right? Or larger, more complex risks, right? But that should be the standard for practically any property and casualty type of insurer.
Yeah, because I think now as a consumer, when you file a claim, there's the anxiety of rate increases, cancellation. So yes, you want the claim to be handled quickly and completely and fairly. And I think insurers have put a lot of energy into that. I've certainly, as a consumer, noticed that, like a real emphasis on speed to adjudication on the claim, and they market that, right? The carriers market, how much they've invested in that. But as a consumer, you're still that in the back of your mind, you're like, okay, what does this mean though to my, to my rate and to my renewal probability here?
I think that's one of the roles of AI is to actually help the consumer understanding and consumer transparency as well. I know that there's the complicated side and the purpose of insurance to help execute it, but I think I would not leave out the clearer communication with the consumer in order to make that effective.
Right, because I think historically it's been I interact with my insurance company when they buy the policy or when I have a claim, and there's not a lot more in between there, Whereas I do think you're right. I think health has been much more lean forward in maintaining continuous dialogue with their insureds as a very notable positive sort of trend on the health space in the health space.
I want to double click on something you said, Bill, where you're talking about having AI to help with transparency or help with communications to the end insured. I think, and Tom, feel free to jump in if you've heard otherwise, but I think what I've heard is that there's a desire to apply AI solutions in a consumer facing way, but that it's much riskier innately than it is to apply it to some internal decision making where you've got a human in the loop that's still reviewing everything, because once something goes out, you can't necessarily call it back, right? And so there's some concern about having that representation of having AI represent the company in an interaction. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on what are some of the risks or overwhelming benefits that you would see of applying AI to those like direct interactions.
Yeah, I think any result from AI, someone needs to take responsibility for. So I think that's in terms of internal governance. I see that on the financial services as well as the insurance. When you're setting that up, I think that's something that should always be clear. Whatever happens, whatever result comes from deploying technology, there needs to be someone responsible for the results of that. So, but to deal with some of the scenarios you talked about, I think consumers are smarter now, and they can be trained to know what to expect. And I think going into some of the worst experiences I think I've had, is going through the phone menu, and trying to get to
yeah.
You just keep pressing 0 until you talk to somebody.
Representative, just like 00 or say representative, right? Yeah. Some of the consumer reactions that are recorded from that are enlightening as far as the dissatisfaction. So I think with AI, I think it could be deployed in a way that consumers understand it's not going to completely replace the personal touch. It's only there to facilitate and help them, right? And be efficient to serve what they need. But if there's an urgent situation, it should be able to get to a human quickly, if needed, right? So I think balancing those expectations and really communicating with the customer. When we do online with chat, right? You almost expect today, if you're online with chat, it's probably not a human behind it, right? Mm-hmm. That's probably, I think consumers have adapted to that, and they're not going to get a definitive answer necessarily. You're going to get, I think, you can use AI to get to a particular place where you're ready to confirm the final result, but that actual final button that you push, I think, should be at this point, really limited to a human to be able to make that decision, or certain rules that are absolute that you're willing to follow. And so I think that would be at least where AI is today, the best alternative both for the company and the consumer. So I think there was there's some question about regulation and how that might hinder or help the adoption of AI, because I think what we're talking about here, when you think about effect on consumers, the regulators are intended to essentially protect consumers. And so I think they have, in a number of different areas, they have been very open to that. But as Tom brought up earlier with the situation with, sharing data from your car, I think there are opportunities for regulators to promote transparency to consumers. And I think if the information and really the purpose of the information and really interpreting what it says is transparent to the consumer, I think regulators would be very open to the use of AI and insurers using AI. So I think there's a regulatory solution there, but I think the things that insurers, maybe in a traditional sense, have been doing is thinking everything they're doing with AI is behind the scenes, or they collect data behind the scenes and they don't really communicate what they're collecting or how they're using it to the consumers. And I think that's probably the friction with the regulators. The process of providing permissions for, let's say, a manufacturer to collect your data. If you're buying a car, if you think about all the different things you sign when you buy a car, if the permissions are just one other thing that you're signing is one of 20 documents, did you really read it? And I think that's probably, even if you gave permission, do you really understand what you just gave permission to? And I think that standard is not something that companies should rely upon. It's just that they sign some permissions. I think it's the common sense standard that says, does a consumer actually with their experience understand what's going on? And I think that standard is what regulation is probably more geared towards than the technical definition of signing or approving some sort of, permissions.
Yeah, and I think the carrier's opportunity to educate the consumer how it can benefit them as the insured, whether it's a better rates or risk prevention or those kind of things. I think that there hasn't been enough sort of plain English dialogue about why do we want this data, what are we going to do with it. And I think the regulators try to enforce that too, but it still ends up being very dense language, hard to parse in very long documents, et cetera, when you try to look at terms and conditions and things of that nature.
So think about maybe the business owner and think about small business. And this is where a lot of innovation is occurring in small business, because I think the data is there to be able to facilitate it. But if you're a small business owner, you really want, and if you're probably a pretty busy person, right? Small business are typically intense businesses. So you have a certain amount of information that you have collected through your business dealings, right? And you have them stored digitally or readily available. And how do you go from having them in your hands to communicating them to an insurer? And I think if you think about it that way, instead of it's just a data ingestion process, or it's just a data sharing and some sort of insurance process, but if you actually just consider it an exchange of information and interpretation of documents that a consumer already has, then you can build things, I think, that can really accelerate and make efficient the whole insurance process. So if you already have it on hand and you have a way through AI to, let's say, interpret a lease, to interpret even a picture of my property, right? Forget about okay, there are drones collecting, conditions of roof, but I can go out and take a picture of my roof too. Or a business owner can take a picture of their business, right? Or they have their lease document. They have these artifacts that are already generated from the course of doing business. You can leverage a platform that is flexible to ingest and interpret any of these inputs, right? That's an AI platform that would be incredibly valuable if you made it really flexible to handle what consumers or potential insurers already have.
This has been a really interesting conversation. I think we've gone deeper into especially some of the personal lines implications of AI and in insurance. So that's super helpful topic.
We haven't done a deep dive on telematics and how it relates to AI and even some of the data regulatory concerns. So this was an enlightening episode for sure. Thanks for joining us.
I appreciate the opportunity. I'd love to promote the transformation of the insurance industry. I think people like yourselves are very much necessary to help the insurance industry make this transformation. So I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to when we can get together again. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill.
Great. Thanks a lot, Bill.